Right now, geopolitical analysts everywhere are doing the same thing, opening their 1973 playbooks. It's automatic. On February 28, 2026, over 1,200 bombs rained down on Iran in a single night, and everyone studying this conflict did what they always do when war hits the Middle East. They grabbed the only map that's ever worked, the 1973 map, the Yom Kippur War. 20 days of combat, a negotiated ceasefire, superpower pressure, economic leverage through oil, and an organized exit that kept governments intact, borders unchanged, and most importantly, the negotiating structures needed to end it. This map seems reasonable. It feels familiar. And that's exactly why it'll lead every analyst relying on it to the wrong answer. On February 28, 2026, the US and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran. Operation Epic Fury for the Americans. Operation Roaring Lion for the Israelis. Over 1,200 bombs in the first 24 hours. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. B-1 Lancers. B-52 Stratofortresses. The biggest combined strike package the Middle East has seen in decades. And on the very first day, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Not in a drawn-out battle. Not in gradual escalation. In the opening strike. Since then, Iran has launched more than 500 ballistic missiles and 2,000 drones against Israel, American bases in the Gulf, and embassies. Jordan intercepted 49 Iranian drones and missiles. Lebanon and Hezbollah activated a secondary theater. Brent crude oil jumped from $70 to over $80 in a matter of days. Freight rates surged by 94%, hitting an all-time high of $423,736 a day. Over 1,560 flights were canceled across the Middle East. 41% of an entire Monday's operations. Donald Trump said the conflict could last 4 to 5 weeks, but it could go way beyond that. 4 weeks to collapse, that's the headline. But what collapse actually means depends entirely on which map you're using. And the 1973 map, as intuitive as it seems, is systematically flawed on 4 specific structural points. This video maps out all 4. The decapitation of leadership, the fragmentation of the exit mechanism, the technological scale that 1973 didn't account for, and the economic ticking clock that no ceasefire can turn off. Before we tear down the 1973 model, let's understand why it works so well. It does work, just for the wrong conflict. The Yom Kippur War began on October 6, 1973, with a coordinated surprise attack. Egypt advancing through the Sinai, Syria attacking through the Golan Heights. Israel, caught completely off guard on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, retreated before counterattacking with full force. The fighting lasted 20 days before a negotiated ceasefire took effect on October 25th. What made that resolution possible? First, both sides had functioning governments with real power. Anwar Sadat ruled Egypt. Hafez al-Assad ruled Syria. Israel had a government that could make decisions and actually implement them. They could all sign agreements people would actually honor. Second, it wasn't about regime change. Egypt wanted the Sinai back. Syria wanted the Golan Heights. Nobody was trying to destroy the other side's government. The war had clear, specific goals that could be haggled over at a table. Third, both superpowers wanted the fighting to stop. The USSR backed the Arabs. The US backed Israel. Neither wanted this thing going nuclear. That pressure worked. The US and USSR co-sponsored UN Security Council Resolution 338, and the ceasefire took effect. Fourth, oil was a political tool, not a physical disruption. OPEC members decided to cut production and sales. It was reversible. One decision turned the faucet off. One decision turned it back on. The Strait of Hormuz stayed open. Nobody was firing missiles at ships. Put these 4 pieces together and the 1973 model spits out a clear prediction for any Middle East conflict. 3 to 4 weeks of fighting, oil pressure, superpower negotiations, and a UN-brokered ceasefire. That's exactly what analysts are predicting right now for 2026. But here's the problem. All 4 pillars just collapsed in 2026. The most comfortable historical analogy turned into an analytical trap. And we're already measuring the cost in lives, in dollars, and in decisions nobody knows how to undo. The first of them was destroyed in the very first hour of the conflict. February 28, 2026, Thursday. At 2:37 a.m. in Tehran, Israeli laser-guided bombs started hitting targets deep inside Iran. Operation Roaring Lion. At the same moment, American B-2 Spirit aircraft, the world's only active stealth bombers, penetrated Iranian airspace from the east. Operation Epic Fury coordinated the B-2s with B-1 Lancers and B-52 Stratofortresses in a coordinated strike that took months to plan. Within 24 hours, Israel had dropped over 1,200 bombs. To put that number into perspective, the entire Operation Desert Storm in 1991 used approximately 88,000 tons of munitions over a 43-day campaign. What happened on February 28, 2026, was a concentration of force that compressed the equivalent of weeks of conventional operations into a single night. The scale is unprecedented for a single day of combined operations in the modern Middle East. But what changed everything, the fact that separates 2026 from any previous regional conflict in the post-WW2 era, wasn't the scale of the bombs. It was the target. Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader since 1989, was killed in the opening strikes on February 28. Think about what that actually means. In 1973, Sadat could negotiate. Assad could negotiate. Golda Meir could negotiate. Everyone had someone who could sign an agreement and actually make it stick. Ending a modern war requires governments on both sides that can actually function. It needs someone who can say, "We stop here," and have the troops listen. In 1973, that mechanism existed. In 2026, on the first day, in the opening strike, it was destroyed on the Iranian side. This isn't abstract diplomacy. This is how ceasefires actually work. Someone has to sign an agreement and guarantee troops will obey it. Who does that for Iran now? That is the question February 28 planted. The answer, or the lack thereof, defines what comes next. Iran isn't a normal democracy with a clear line of succession. It's a theocracy with two power centers: the elected government and the clerical hierarchy, with the supreme leader pulling the strings over both. The IRGC answers to the supreme leader, not the president. When Khamenei died, the IRGC's command structure was left without a recognized center of authority. The troops didn't stop fighting. But now, multiple power centers in the military and clerical hierarchy are fighting for succession, each with their own ideas about how to run the war. In a bilateral war with strong leadership like 1973, it's simple. You find who's in charge. They give the word. Troops obey. In 2026, with Iran's command fractured, any ceasefire deal raises a problem. Who speaks for Tehran? And if one IRGC faction signs, will the others actually listen? History doesn't have a clean example of this. A supreme leader killed in the opening hours before the military could even fully respond is unprecedented in the modern era. Gaddafi died after months of civil war. Saddam was captured months into the invasion. This is different. Khamenei's death was immediate. There's no designated successor. There's no institutional blueprint for what happens next. This is what we might call the decapitation trap. The logic is perverse. The more successful the initial strike, the more completely it destroyed Iran's leadership, the harder it becomes to find someone to negotiate with. Win the battle, lose the exit. This isn't speculation, it's basic fact. Somebody has to guarantee the peace will hold. The casualty numbers tell the story. Iran's Foundation of Martyrs recorded 1,045 Iranian military deaths in the first 5 days. The American side: 6 dead, 4 from an Iranian strike on a Kuwait base. 6 Americans, 1,045 Iranians. And at the top of Iran's power structure, a vacuum nobody's seen before. The decapitation trap is set. And the answer to how we get out of it, if one even exists, will depend on 3 factors we'll look at later. But first, you need to understand the scale of what Iran threw back. While the leadership vacuum formed in Tehran, the Iranian response to the opening strike was arriving. And the numbers need to be stated clearly, because it's the only way to understand what they mean. 5 days, February 28th to March 4th, Iran fired over 500 ballistic missiles and 2,000 drones at Israel, US bases in the Gulf, and American embassies across the region. Think about what that actually means operationally. In 1973, Egypt had Soviet T-55 tanks, conventional artillery, and the shock of crossing the Suez. A traditional army on mapped terrain with clear front lines. 2026 Iran? completely different animal. Iran's ballistic missiles have 1,000 to 2,000 kilometer ranges and hundreds of kilograms of payload. These aren't improvised, they're precision systems from decades of development now being fired in numbers. The Shahed 136 drones work on a different principle: overwhelm the defense systems through sheer volume. It's not about individual sophistication, it's about math and attrition. Every Iron Dome or David's Sling intercept costs $40,000 to $150,000. Each Shahed costs about $20,000. Iran can keep this going until the defenders' logistics break. Picture 2,000 drones swarming in waves over 5 days. Not in an uncoordinated manner, but as part of a calculated saturation pattern to exhaust defense resources. Which threat do you engage first? Which one do you let slip through? Jordan demonstrated this reality clearly. It intercepted 49 Iranian drones and missiles flying over its airspace. The Hashemite Kingdom, without being at war with Iran, had to activate its anti-aircraft defenses to protect its own aerial sovereignty. This didn't exist in 1973. 1973 had specific battlefields: the Sinai, the Golan Heights, with clear positions and front lines. 2026 is simultaneous across the whole region. Missiles from Iran hitting Israel. American bases in Kuwait and the Gulf under attack. Jordan intercepting drones over its own territory. Hezbollah fighting in Lebanon. Each one is its own front with its own logic. This isn't two sides with one front. It's a distributed conflict the 1973 model can't map. And there's no single exit. And this architecture has direct implications for the central question: how does this conflict end? Part of that answer lies in who is part of this conflict, and who exactly has the authority to end it. In 1973, the US and USSR could make a deal. Americans talked to Israel, Soviets talked to the Arabs. Together, they pushed UN Resolution 338 through, and the ceasefire happened. 2 sides, 2 patrons. Done. 2026, not bilateral. The attacking side is a coalition, US and Israel. That means any exit deal needs Washington and Tel Aviv aligned, not just one party's signature. 2 governments, different voters, different political timelines, different ideas about what winning means. Iran's side has the succession mess we already covered, a fractured command structure. And there are 2 additional complications that the 1973 model simply has no room to accommodate. First, Hezbollah. From day one, Lebanon opened a second front. Hezbollah is fighting hard. A ceasefire between the US, Israel, and whatever's left of Iran doesn't automatically stop Lebanon. Hezbollah has its own command structure, its own goals, and the capacity to keep fighting no matter what happens in Tehran. In 1973, the war ended when Egypt, Syria, and Israel stopped. No secondary actors were strong enough to keep going alone. Hezbollah in 2026 isn't a militia. It's an organized force with weapons, training, and logistics to fight independently for months. Second, Jordan. Jordan's intercepting Iranian drones, which doesn't technically put it at war, but creates a headache that 1973 never dealt with. What's Jordan's role in a ceasefire? Does it have to be at the table? Does it have veto power? In 1973, who signs for each side had obvious answers. In 2026, there's no obvious answer for either side. That's the third breakdown, and combined with the first 2, it creates a puzzle with no obvious solution. But there's one factor that needs no diplomat, needs no signature, and could determine the outcome before any negotiating table is even set up. The fourth divergence has no uniform, no general, no chain of command. It's the Strait of Hormuz, and the economic clock it's running. The Strait of Hormuz, 33 kilometers wide at the narrowest point, between Iran and Oman. 20% of the world's oil passes through it. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, all of it. There's no backup route for this volume. One bottleneck, no alternatives. In 1973, oil was politics. OPEC decided to cut production and stop sales to Israel's allies. It was a choice that could be unchosen. A faucet someone turned off. One political decision could turn it back on. The Suez Canal was closed since 1967, but the strait stayed open. No physical blockade, just political choice. In 2026, the Strait of Hormuz is under actual operational threat. You don't need to physically block it. Just make transit risky enough that shipping companies add premiums, reroute, or avoid it entirely. And it's already happening in real time. Brent crude, $70 before the conflict. Over $80 days later. That's a 14% spike in 1 week. Freight rates, up 94%, hitting $423,736 per day for supertankers. Normal rate? $40,000 to $80,000 a day. The market's pricing in a risk that didn't exist a week ago. Aviation, 1,560 plus flights canceled across the Middle East. That's 41% of operations on a single Monday. A 5-day conflict and global price charts are already rewritten. Here's the critical difference from 1973. Back then, OPEC could choose whether to pressure oil or not. It was negotiable. One political decision turned it on, one decision turned it off. In 2026, the Strait's disruption is operational. It persists as long as the fighting continues. No political deal can fix the Strait independently of the war. The war has to end first. This creates a third clock, market's clock, and it ticks on its own. Generals and diplomats don't control it. What makes this clock dangerous? Nobody controls it. In 1973, the US and USSR just pressured OPEC. Done. There was a chain of command. In 2026, the Strait disruption isn't anyone's political choice. It's caused by a conflict nobody wants to end on anybody else's terms. Economic recovery and military victory are the exact same knot. It could last 4 to 5 weeks, but it could go way beyond that. Trump's words, a statement that shaped expectations and inspired this video's title. But what does 4 weeks actually mean? What would have to be true? 4 things would need to happen simultaneously for this to work. I'll list them. As I do, think about which one you believe is actually likely. First, primary military objectives. Degrading Iranian nukes would need to be achieved. Second, Iran's missile and drone arsenal would need to run out or degrade enough to stop. Third, a Khamenei successor would need to consolidate enough power to negotiate and control the troops. Fourth, economic pressure on Gulf allies would need to stay tolerable for 4 solid weeks. 4 conditions. Let's see what the actual data says. Iran's retaliation, 500 missiles and 2,000 drones in 5 days. That doesn't look like depletion, that looks like maximum intensity. Iran's been producing these for decades. They don't run out in 4 weeks of heavy use. The replacement capacity exists and was built exactly for this scenario. Leadership succession doesn't work on decree. Power transitions in theocracies with competing military structures take months or years, not weeks. History doesn't have a single example of wartime succession resolved in 28 days. While that's unresolved, the IRGC operates without recognized authority. Anyone at the negotiating table claiming to speak for Tehran can be challenged. One faction's signature doesn't bind the others. That uncertainty alone kills the peace process. Economic pressure. Global markets don't have Washington or Tel Aviv's patience. Every week the Strait stays disrupted. Pressure builds from Europe. China, India, countries dependent on Gulf oil who didn't start this war but are paying the price. That pressure compounds. Trump's statement targets his domestic audience. But what determines the actual time frame isn't political talk. It's the military and economic machinery we're breaking down. And those dynamics don't point to a ceasefire in 4 weeks. They point to 3 completely different scenarios. Only one of them ends fast. Now the synthesis. First, what Trump's prediction really means. 4 to 5 weeks makes sense inside the 1973 model. That's how long it took for Soviet-American pressure to force a ceasefire. Trump's using that same clock, consciously or not. But that stopwatch was built for a military architecture that doesn't exist anymore. Apply 1973 metrics to a 2026 battlefield and the instrument works. But it's measuring the wrong war. 4 structural divergences separate 2026 from 1973. Not interpretation. These are architectural differences that make 1973 inapplicable. First, decapitation. 1973 worked because both sides had intact leadership. 2026. Iran lost its supreme leader in the opening strike. No recognized authority to negotiate with. No mechanism to end it. Second, scale. 500 ballistic missiles and 2,000 drones in 5 days have no 1973 equivalent. Asymmetric warfare. Defense saturation. Attrition dynamics that 1973 never modeled. The geometry changed. Third, coalition complexity. 2026 isn't 2 sides. It's US plus Israel attacking, Iran defending with fractured command, Hezbollah fighting independently, Jordan passively defending. A main ceasefire doesn't end Lebanon. Lebanon has its own logic. Fourth, the Strait of Hormuz. 1973. Oil was reversible politics. 2026? The disruption is operational. It persists as long as fighting continues. It creates an independent economic clock nobody directly controls. With these four divergences, collapse in 4 weeks can mean 3 completely different things. The 1973 model doesn't distinguish them. Scenario 1. Rapid military conclusion. If the IRGC fractures from leaderlessness and missiles drones degrade enough over 20-30 days, the war could end in 4 to 6 weeks, but as military victory, not negotiated ceasefire. No table, no UN resolution, no territory swaps. More like Iraq 2003 than Yom Kippur 1973. And 2003 taught us, conventional conflict's end isn't the problem's end. Scenario 2. Prolonged asymmetric insurgency. If the IRGC decentralizes distributing command to regional units like Hezbollah did in Lebanon, the war doesn't end. It dissolves. No central authority means no ceasefire to sign. Just attrition, mounting costs, casualties nobody reports. A war the world stops watching but never actually ends. Scenario 3. Forced third-party intervention. If straight disruption hits critical levels for Europe, China or India before the military conflict resolves, external pressure could force a truce negotiated by actors with no skin in the game. Not a formal ceasefire with signatures. A forced pause. Not because generals agree, because Europe, China, and India can't afford oil anymore. The side fighting doesn't end it. The side paying does. The 1973 model predicts a fourth scenario. Negotiated ceasefire between recognized parties. Superpowers broker it. Limited territorial goals. Organized exit for everyone. That fourth scenario is the only one 2026's structural realities make practically impossible. That's what collapse means in the title. Not necessarily Iran as a state. It's the collapse of the analytical model everyone's using. The collapse of expecting 1973 to repeat. This situation has no historical precedent. And that's why the coming weeks will shock every analyst still using the 1973 map. Think of someone still using it. Send them this video. And if you want to follow this conflict as it unfolds, subscribe. This is the kind of analysis we're building.